So, in the previous class we discussed about the different theories which try to determine the aggregate level of interest rate or level of interest rate in the economy. Then the other issue related to the interest rate is basically the term structure theories of interest rate. So, before we analyze that what exactly the term structure theories of interest rate, let me explain you that why we want to study the concept of term structure theory. That whenever you talk about the term structure interest rate theories or the concept of term structure interest rate, the term structure basically is nothing but that why the interest rate in the long term bond or long term securities are different from the short term securities. So, in general, what kind of questions or what kind of issues the term structure theory is trying to answer are there are two questions what basically they address. One is what determines the difference between long term and short term interest rates, which means that what is that determines the term structure interest rates, and what determines the general structure of interest rates. To be precise, if I give you this example, that whenever we are issuing a particular bond, that one bond's maturity period is 10 years, another bond's maturity period is 5 years, you might have observed that the bond whose maturity period is 10 years, they provide more return than the bond whose maturity period is 5 years. Why is it so? Why basically this yield or the return from a long term bond is more than the return from a short term bond? That is the first question. And what is the second question? The second question is that whenever even if with the same term to maturity, you will observe that maybe one bond's maturity period is 10 years and another bond the same bond whose maturity period is also 10 years, but the issuers are different. Maybe one bond is issued by one agency, another bond is issued by another agency. So, you might have observed still even if with the same maturity, the interest rates or the return from these two different bonds are vary. Why it is varying? Why basically even if with the same maturity, the interest rate or the return from these two bonds differ. So, here basically there are lot of issues or lot of reasons behind that, and all those reasons and all those concepts are explained through the different theories of term structure interest rate. So, in a general sense, if you in a very layman perspective or in a very common perspective, you want to define what do we mean by the term structure interest rate or what do we mean by the term structure. The term structure basically examines the relationship between the yield to maturity and the maturity period. Just now I said that one 10 years bond, one 5 years bond. So, here your 10 years or 5 years are the maturity period, and the return or the yield what you are getting from this, if you are holding the bond up to that maturity, that is basically your YTM or the yield to maturity. So, the particular curve which shows the relationship between yield to maturity and this term to maturity, that is basically called the yield curve. So, the yield curve determination or how to derive the yield curve, that basically we get through this term structure interest rate theories. That means, the term structure interest rate theories basically try to help us to derive the yield curve of a particular bond. So, these are the major issues always we encounter whenever we talk about the term structure theories of interest rate. So, let us see that how that particular theory works. You see, already I have mentioned you or I have discussed with you that the term structure theories try to explain or try to measure the yield curve of a particular bond. But then what is the shape, how the particular yield curve looks like, what is the shape of that yield curve? If you say in general sense, always you might have known that the return from a long term bond is always more than the return from a short term bond. If the return from a long term bond is more than the return from a short term bond, then always we can find there is a positively sloped yield curve. That means, the yield curve can be positively sloped with long term rates being greater than the short term ones, that always we can find out. And that kind of yield curve is basically known as the normal yield curve or the upward yield curve. So, how it basically exactly look like? If in one axis we have the term to maturity, another axis we have the yield to maturity, mostly the yield curve looks like this. That means, if this is your yield to maturity and this is your maturity period, if maturity is increasing, then the yield is also increasing. So, this is basically a upward yield curve or positively sloped yield curve. So, this is basically also the normal yield curve, but in general sense always we know that the long term yield is always more than, or the bonds having longer maturity gives more yield than the bonds having shorter maturity. And this is usually convex. From below that that particular diagram basically shows that, and with the YTM flattening out in the higher maturity. So, if you go for higher maturity period, you will find not much fluctuations in terms of the yield whenever you compare it with the shorter term maturity bonds. So, the yield curve also can be negatively sloped, where the short term rates is greater than the long term rates. So, that is also a possibility that the short term rates can be lesser than the long term rates, and when it is possible, whenever this purchasing power of the consumer is very low, or the inflation rate is quite high in the economic system. In that time, investing in the short term is relatively more risky than investing in the long term. The reason is, if the inflation is already high, that there is a high probability that in the near future this inflation rate may go down. So, because of that, what happens that obviously the return or the yield from the short term bonds may be more than the return or yield from the long term bonds. So, this is what basically the yield curve or an inverted yield curve we can observe. In some of the countries, whenever there is some kind of this kind of situation arises, you might have observed the shape of the yield curve looks basically inverted. So, this is what basically we are talking about for the inverted yield curve. So, here like normal yield curves, these curves also tend to be convex with yield flattening out at the higher maturity. The yield curve also can be relatively flat. The yield curve also can be relatively flat if the short term rate and long term rate both are different. So, that is basically another way of understanding, way of looking this yield curve, that if the long term yield and short term yield both are same, then what you can say that the yield to maturity is invariant to the term to maturity. So, with the change in the term to maturity, the return or yield also is not going to be changed. So, after this if you see that just now I have told that and this is the way this shape of the yield curve looks like. This diagram I have shown you, that is a normal yield curve, and if it is inverse yield curve, this is the way basically the inverse yield curve looks like. You see your YTM term to maturity increases, your YTM basically changes, right. So, this is basically the another type of yield curve. Then this is basically your flat yield curve, which is your yield is or yield to maturity is not changing even if the period is changing. So, whatever period you are talking about, the yield is not going to be changed. So, that is basically we call it the flat yield curve. And the yield curve, already I have mentioned you, the yield curve shows the relationship between your yield and term to maturity So, this is what basically we talked about whenever we talk about the yield curve, and this is convex from below, that is already we have explained in the previous slide. So, then we have, after getting this idea that what this yield curve looks like and what are those different types of yield curve can be prevailed in the market, then we can move into the another argument on this, that what are those factors which decide the shape of the yield curve. So, obviously, the shape of the yield curve depends upon the types of the bonds. You know, there are different type of bonds available in the market. You have high rated bond like AAA or B rated, all kind of bonds. So, obviously, the long term bonds give low return. The yield from the long term bond, the yield from the long term bond is low, and yield from the low rated bond is high. It is the high rated bond and it is the low rated bond. So, that is what, because this is more risky, and that is why to compensate the risk, the issuer can provide more yield for the low rated bond to the investors. And another one, the economic conditions, obviously monetary conditions, monetary policy. If obviously, if the policy rates, are very low, then obviously the interest rate in the market also will be low. So, because of that we can expect that yield also will be low, because that time the money supply in the economy will be very high. The policy rate will be low, the interest rate will be low, then there is this that will have the impact upon the yield in that particular point of time. So, so in this context, this yield may increase, because the price also gets affected by that. So, the monetary policy means if the interest rate goes up, if tight monetary policy means if interest rate goes up, then the money supply basically goes down, then it will have the impact on the investment on the different financial securities, then obviously your yield also gets affected. So, this is what basically this economic conditions including monetary policy also affect the shape of the yield curve in the economic system. Then the maturity preferences of investors and borrowers, that we will discuss through the different theories, that for example, some investors prefer only to invest in the long term bond on the basis of their requirements, because if somebody wants money after 10 years, then he can, and specific amount of money they want to get out of this, or specific amount of return they want to get out of this, then what they do? They prefer to invest in the long term bond instead of investing in the short term bond. But there are certain investors or certain participants, they always prefer to invest in the short term, investment horizon period is very short. Therefore, there is a preference. So, always we will find that under this economic conditions, the investors basically is interested for investing in the long term bond and short term bond, that basically will decide that how the shape of the yield curve will look like. And also the investors and borrowers expectations about the future rates, future interest rate, inflation and the state of the economy. So, how this economy is going to behave in the future in terms of the different macroeconomic fundamentals, that also affect the yield of that from that particular bond, and accordingly the yield curve shape can be changed. So, this is what basically the common factors which can decide the shape of the yield curve, but we can explain all those arguments through different theories. Then the basic question here is how the long term interest rates can be determined. What is the logic through different, what kind of different theoretical arguments through which we can say this is the way the long term interest rate can be determined. So, we have 4 theories which explain basically the term structure interest rate theories. One is your pure expectations theory, you have the liquidity premium theory, you have the preferred habitat theory, then you have the market segmentation theory. These are the 4 different theories which explain the term structure interest rate theories in the system. So, one by one we will see that how this interest rate theory is trying to explain that how the long term interest rate is determined in the financial system. So, first of all, if you see the pure expectations theory is based upon certain assumptions, and mostly the pure expectations theory is believing that there is a perfect competition in the available in the market. That means, there are more number of buyers and sellers exist. Investors are rational, that means, they want to maximize their yield in that holding period, everybody is thinking rationally. Investors have a perfect foresight, and large enough body of investors hold uniform expectations about the future changes in the different interest rates like short term interest rates and the prices of that particular security. There is no transaction cost, and obviously, the risk is neutral here in this particular context. The risk is not available, or risk is this, that everything can be predictable from the beginning. That is why there is no uncertainty which is existing in the market, and the securities of the different maturities are perfect substitutes. That means what? If anybody there is no difference in terms of the investment horizon period, anybody can invest in any type of bonds in terms of the maturity. So, in the previous slide we were explaining that some people prefer to invest in the long term bond, some people will be invested in the short term bond, but here whenever we are explaining the pure expectations theory, we believe that there is no such kind of preferences or differences in terms of the short term and long term bonds. Everybody wants to invest in or there is some kind of perfect substitutability between the short term and long term bonds which are available or existing in the financial system. And holding period is the period of time for which the investor plans to hold or actually hold the security. It may be same with the maturity or it may differ from the maturity, but if it is longer than maturity period, the investor must reinvest in that particular bond, or if it is shorter, he must sell the security before the maturity is over. So, that means, here what here we are trying to explain, let there is a bond whose maturity period is 10 years, then the investor if go on up to 10 years, the investor can sell the bond after 5 years, after 5 years they can sell the bond, or they can hold up the bond up to the maturity, or if they are trying to hold that bond after this maturity, then they have to again reinvest in that bond, they can extend that maturity period, because maturity period is fixed from the beginning. So, therefore, these are the different assumptions what this pure expectation theory takes. Then using these assumptions, what this theory basically tries to explain? It explains that the today's long term rate is the unbiased average, the average can be arithmetic or geometric of the current short term rate and the successive forward rates, or we can call it expected one period short term rates during the period of long term loan. So, for example, if you want to calculate the long term rate, where here in this case your R n is equal to the long term rate, let n is equal to 3. So, then what basically we are trying to measure this, if you are using this, that 1 plus R n t is equal to nothing but 1 plus R 1. Here the R 1 is basically the current spot rate, and we have the forward implied forward rates, that is 1 plus R 1 t plus 1 into 1 plus R 2 t plus 2, so on, and then you can take the geometric mean of that to the power 1 by n, then that basically will give you that what is the long term rate for that particular 3 years or 4 years. And here the one thing is this R which is basically your forward rate. that we have to measure it. And if you know this spot rate of today, then forward rate of the next year, then we can calculate the spot rate of 2 years bond or 3 years bond from today. So, in this context it is nothing but the long term rate is a arithmetic or geometric mean of the current spot rate and the future or the forward rates in that for that particular bond in the financial market in that particular point of time. So, then this is what basically we are talking about the definition of the pure expectation theory. Then we can see that how this particular theory works. So, if you are trying to find out this is your general formula for this pure expectations theory. Then here if one example, for example, a 7-year spot rate is 15% and 6-year spot rate is 13%. If you want to calculate the forward rate or implied forward rate from this, then it is nothing but 1 plus 0.15 to the power 7 divided by 1.3 to the power 6 minus 1, that is 27.7%. Or if this 27.7% is available to you or 13% is available to you, then you can also calculate this 15%, which is the spot rate for the 7 years maturity bonds. So, this is what basically the pure expectations theory is trying to explain. So, in overall what it tries to measure? It tries to measure that if you have the current spot rate or short term spot rate, one short term rate, and you have the forward rates, then the long term rate can be calculated, and this long term rate is nothing but it is the arithmetic mean or the geometric mean of these two rates, current spot rate and the implied forward rates which are available in this particular system. So, this is the way the long term rate can be calculated. So, this is what the expectations theory is trying to explain. So, another thing here that if you observe that the expectations theory is trying to incorporate, trying to measure the expected spot rate from today, what is going to happen after 2 years, after 3 years or after 4 years, and depending upon the implied forward rate and the spot rate, the long term interest rate of that particular bond can be calculated. So, here if you want to see that how basically this theory works and what is the how basically this kind of conclusion we can draw. So, the long term rate will be higher than the short term rate if the yield curve will upward sloping, if the investor expect future short term spot rate would be higher than the current short term spot rate. So, if you see just now what we are trying to say, we are trying to say that here the question, this issue was your long term rate is the arithmetic mean or the geometric mean of current spot rate and the forward rates, right. So, here what we are trying to say that if you after the measurement, if the forward rates are basically are more than the current spot rate, then obviously the long term rate, the average of these two rates will be more in the long run. So, the long term rate obviously will be more than the long term spot rate will be more than the current short term spot rate, if your expected short term forward rates will be more than or will be increasing or will be more than the current spot rates. So, this is what basically we are talking about. So, in that particular point of time, if your yield curve basically looks like this, but if the long term rate will be lower than the short term rate, that means the yield curve will be downward sloping, that already we have shown this, then what is happening? When it happens, when the investors expect the future short term spot rate would be to be fall below the current short term spot rate. That means, the future spot rates, what we are expected spot rates, what we are calculating, expected spot rates or the forward rates what you are calculating. If this is basically which is calculated on the basis of the forward rates and the spot rate of the today, if this one is basically declining or will be lesser than the current spot rate, then what is happening, the short term rate will be more than the long term rate. So, this is that, then that particular point of time what we can observe? We can observe that the yield curve basically downward sloping, and in that point of time we call it, this is a inverted yield curve. This is a inverted yield curve. So, if no changes in future short term spot rates are expected, then the long term and short term rate will be equal to each other, and finally, the yield curve will be flat. So, this is what basically we can say, the yield curve will be flat. So, in overall if you see that the pure expectations theory basically tries to explain about the future short term interest rates are the only determinants of the term structure interest rates, and there is no other factor. We have to know only the current spot rate and the future short term interest rates or the forward rates, then we can calculate the long term rate of a particular bond by using these two different variables, which is simply the geometric or arithmetic mean of those rates which are available in the system. Please go through this particular references for this particular session. Thank you.